Hello and welcome back to the Okta Developer and Integrator podcast. I'm Emily,
And I'm Jeff.
and today we are joined by special guests Aaron and Matt. Welcome to the podcast, or welcome back. You want to tell us a bit about yourselves and why you're here today?
I'll go first. Matt Egan, Director of Tech Strategy. I work in the corporate development organization here at Okta. It gives me a lot of exposure to everything from our venture capital arm, Okta Ventures, to M&A and strategic partnerships, where I end up working on integrations with hundreds of ISVs over my almost 8 years at Okta. So excited to be here and talk about Octane.
And Aaron, I think you have a fancy new job title since we last talked on here.
That's a good point. Yeah, identity standards now. Nice to be here. So I work on a lot of specs for OAuth, OpenID Connect, a couple other things as well, and lately been working a lot on the OAuth extension that we've been using for cross-app access, and going to hear about that a lot at Octane, I think. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I work a lot with Matt and Aaron in my day-to-day, so thank you guys for being on the podcast.
Yeah, so we have briefly explained cross-app access in the past. What I personally, as an end user, think of as the problem that we're solving is asking end users to consent to sharing their employer or their organization's data with some third-party service. It's bad user experience, and do we really want to be trusting everyone to be a security professional in every organization? Or can we make this better as we have more and more applications that need to integrate with one another? And now, especially as we have AI agents that we need to integrate in appropriate ways and share the right data, but not the wrong data with them on the user's behalf.
Yeah, it's a really interesting problem. There's, I guess, like two main angles to it. One is the one you mentioned of like, is it really the user's business, the employee's business, to decide whether a company's application can share data with another company's application? No, not really. But like from a personal OAuth perspective, absolutely, right? Like I need to make sure that I choose whether my Google data is shared with a third-party application. But that doesn't really translate in the employer scenario. So it really should be the decision of the company to decide which applications share data, just like it's the decision of the company of which applications to use in the first place that get configured for a single sign-on. So it's just that there hasn't been a way to manage that with any specs prior to what we've been working on here.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's there's been some interesting discussions come up as I've seen other people talking about cross-app access, and had a LinkedIn thread that started where there was some, I don't know, I'd say consternation about the idea of removing that consent dialogue. And I think it's actually a more appropriate codification of who actually owns the data and who should be giving that informed consent. Think about what's the informed consent for an employee in that relationship, and it really moves more into like, have I accepted the terms of use within the employee manual? Am I trained in the in the LMS? Have I gone through the data handling requirements? Like that's the employee's responsibility. And so cross-app access kind of introduces an opportunity. I'm not saying we're solving that problem today, but it introduces this opportunity for the IDP to be in the middle and broker a number of those things. And I envision a future where potentially we're plugging into the learning management system, and that becomes a part of what that flow could be, optionally in a company thing. But it's a really important step to just even opening the door for something like that. Something that's I don't even know how you begin to really do that today in the absence of cross-app access.
Well, it's interesting too that LMSs have actually attempted to solve this, and you see this a lot with the iteration of ways to build interconnected apps on behalf of people. A couple of like thoughts that I have just historically, that one, we left this remnant of B2C moving into these interconnected apps like for so long into the enterprise. Like it makes sense to us. Like I think what's interesting, the interesting microcosm is, I'm really confident if you're saying like I need to share like my documents and my information data, I'm really all about making sure I have that consent. As an employee, I lose a lot of that confidence because like, am I doing the right thing? And also like, who's at risk? If they know that I'm the one that granted that access, is it me that has to face the consequences, or are they actually going to look at the application that kind of like got me there? But I don't know, because the application is not really a thing, but I've actually got a real job and stuff. So, but anyway, getting back to the LMSs, like this is more machine focused. Like, how can I put the two machines together and transfer that data? And so the user kind of gets lost in that shuffle as well. And what I like about where we're evolving to is a state where like there's actually like equal footing between the machine caller and the user that needs to have this consent. And we're also like binding that with the visibility and control at the IDP. So it feels like natural evolution, kind of like a Darwinian kind of thing, but not to take away from Aaron's innovation, because seeing all of these pieces that need to be put together, it was really like very novel how he was able to construct this draft. But it makes a ton of sense. And actually that's what we hear from ISVs and customers.
Aaron, could you tell us a bit about putting that draft together and how you were able to find the right point in this incredibly complex system of standards to make this particular change to solve this particular problem?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't take all the credit for sure. This really kicked off with Carl McGinnis, who is a co-author of the OAuth draft with me. Back when he was at Okta, saw this problem of, you know, admin visibility of the OAuth grants between applications not being there, and put that in front of me and said, like, you know, we've got this problem. Like, here's a rough outline of how I think we should solve it. And I kind of just like sat on that for a while and just let it sink in, and started working on different ways we could take building blocks that are in the OAuth ecosystem and make it work. We went through several iterations of the actual mechanisms of how to do it before landing on what we currently have. And a lot of what I was doing in that process was rewriting it to use more of the existing and standard building blocks that already exist. So, for example, the first step had always been the idea of using a token exchange to exchange an ID token for something, and but token exchange is a framework and it's extensible. And the first version of it was far more custom. There was like more custom things and more things that you had to add to the request and response, and it was basically token exchange was just, you could just barely see that through the spec. So I spent some time working on like, how can we trim it down and make it work more closely like the token exchange spec, and then how can we use something for the second leg? How can we find something that's already there and use that for the second leg, as opposed to using, you know, making something up custom for that or whatever. So it was a lot of like, because I've been in the OAuth space for so long, I'm pretty familiar with a lot of the RFCs, at least at a high level, if not into the weeds of all of them. But just having that like broad knowledge of what all is out there and how people use things, I was able to kind of put it together in a way that was what I hope feels natural.
Yeah, it sounds like a fascinating editorial process of almost looking at each component and going, can we use something close enough for this to save people from having to rebuild something? Matt, are you able to share about the feedback that we've gotten on it from the integrators and the businesses who have had a chance to play around with it and see what it can do?
It's really interesting. You jump into a lot of these conversations, and as we lay out the problem, oftentimes we'll get into these conversations, and you'll end up hearing the ISVs. I remember specifically, I think it was Box that ultimately had said, we had a spec. We've just been waiting for you to build this. You know, we've been saying, you know, why hasn't Okta built this yet? Is something that we've heard at least, you know, once or twice. So, you know, the general thing that we find is, especially with ISVs that have a large ecosystem of OAuth apps, so Box, Zoom, Slack come to mind, they get it right off. They've been dealing with the burden of end user consent flows that everybody's familiar with. If you're a Slack user like we are, we love Slack. And it doesn't feel like a problem, but you do end up going through that when you think about the scale of, I have thousands of employees and we have hundreds of apps and we want them all to be, you know, connecting. You end up with consent fatigue, where from an IT perspective, you really would just like everybody to jump in and have Slack and have it automatically be connected to all of the data sources that have been configured, so that everybody has a consistent user experience. So people that have been in the space for a little longer, they click faster. I will say the more nascent companies, you know, the hot open AIs of the world, they understand what we're trying to solve, but they haven't felt the pain as acutely yet. So it's on the spectrum of how much pain have people incurred and how quickly are they trying to move. But in general, I would say the consensus, everybody agrees with the problem statement, and now we're just in this interlock of it is a three-party problem, and so everybody's waiting for a first mover, and so we expect to see a pretty quick adoption curve.
The one thing that does get people's eyes to light up is this idea that, especially in these tools that are AI tools, but also in the kind of platform integration platform tools like workflow automation stuff, where you have someone wanting to use an interface to connect data from multiple different places. So a lot of the AI use cases are obviously that. The thing that really gets people to be like, oh yeah, this is gonna be a problem, is the realization that, like, if you want to connect this tool to 20 different data sources in the company, each person at the company would have to go through and connect the tool and go through an OAuth flow and sign into the IDP, and then do it again for the second one, go do through an OAuth flow, sign into the IDP again, and doing that 20 times before they can even start building the thing they're trying to do, right? And it's not a good user experience, and it's also on top of the admin visibility problem of the admins not being able to see those connections. So that kind of like amplification of the friction of an OAuth flow is what really gets people to be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I get it. I can see that's going to be a problem. And it's just that some people haven't had the time in the market with the companies at that scale where they're hearing the complaints yet. But it's very clear to see that that is like, that train is headed right for them.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the other interesting points to draw out is, in the absence of this, you can tell when somebody's been considering an alternative option, and the alternative options are usually like, well, let's just use a service account and go and scrape all of the data. You need to inherit all of the ACLs and enforce all of the ACLs, and that's a lot of liability for an integrator to carry. It's going to be friction when you're trying to onboard those apps, because now you've got to bring IT in. There's going to be larger security reviews. That's been a nice thing. You see the light bulbs turn on when people realize, oh, I can abandon that that pursuit that was just going to open up another can of worms down the road. So it's not very often that you're able to go in and say, hey, we're going to improve the security outcomes and the end user experience. And that's it's kind of like a bang bang. It's not often that you get to do both.
When you say scrape all of the data from something, even if it's a small amount of data, let's say per user, you scale that and suddenly your storage costs start looking scary as well.
There's the storage costs, but having to arbitrate that data access is like handling nuclear waste material. It's just a liability that nobody wants to take on.
Yeah, there's like the giant situation of the risk, and then the footnote of the dollar signs. And if you can see the risk, then it's obvious. But even if you can't see the risk, there's still the dollar signs.
Yep.
I'm laughing here because I think it's a good example of like how Matt and Aaron and I are sharing a brain on this, because I was going to ask, like, what do you guys feel is that aha moment? And like, those are exactly the two that I see. I'm seeing more of like the architecture of like what an agent might look like. So getting like, how am I going to store all of this stuff? And we push again to the side, like similar to what we've done with our end user consent. We're like, we'll worry about the identity security a little bit later. And when you actually start to talk about the scale questions, suddenly the things like governance and management and all of the other like key capabilities to keep the access for these agents safe comes like rushing to the forefront. And so, yeah, like, I mean, it's very rare that you find something that really balances like making just an overall security posture improvement, but as well as like improving the lives of like an admin in the case of having to create multiple high privileged accounts and manage all of those across many different domains, or the end user are having to answer consents for many different scopes across many different domains.
When Matt was mentioning consent fatigue, I was also thinking about the fish risk of what happens when the user is trained that when you're asked to share your data, you just always have to hit yes, that's just what you do.
The hackers have been getting creative, right? Like, we've solved a lot of the hacks that used to take place. Password reuse still happens, yes, but like, it's a relatively rare actual attack now, because we've got multi-factor auth, we've got passkeys, like all these things have stopped a lot of the older hacks. So the attackers have been getting creative and having to find new ways to break in. And I feel like the two main categories that are happening now are token theft. That happens still a lot, even though there are some reasonably good standard solutions to the problem, just not as widely deployed yet, clearly. But the other one, interestingly, is OAuth phishing. And it's exactly that problem of there is no protocol flaw at all. There is a legitimate OAuth client doing a legitimate OAuth flow to a real server with a real user account. It's just that the user got tricked into allowing that application to connect. And that is still a pretty big problem. And you will find examples written up in major tech press all the time about it. And this is cross-app access is one of the answers to this problem because it removes the possibility for the user to accidentally agree to the OAuth grant. And if you've just removed that from the process, you've removed the opportunity to do phishing, to do the phishing attack. So I think it's really important.
When you mention token theft as well, cross-app access gets us on to shorter-lived credentials than the traditional tokens. So tell us a bit about those changes.
I want to be clear, the token theft is absolutely still possible with cross-app access unless you also do token binding through Depop or something, right? Like cross-app access by itself does not solve token theft because at the end of cross-app access, the result is the application has an access token for another application, just like if it had been issued through a regular OAuth grant. So it doesn't change anything after the token's issued compared to the normal OAuth flow. You can layer on Depop onto that just like you can with a regular OAuth flow. Depop being a way to bind the token so that if the token is stolen, it can't be used because the private key wouldn't have been able to be stolen because in the same way the token was stolen. So you can still layer those on. But your point about lending itself more to shorter lived tokens is absolutely correct because in traditional OAuth, the user is the one involved in the issuing of the access token, which means it's just going to naturally happen that applications want to involve the user as little as possible because of the friction. So they will try to get very long-lived tokens. Like if you think about like you're trying to connect one application, some application to read your calendar data and like constantly sync the data, that application is going to want extremely long-lived access to your calendar because otherwise it's going to stop working until the next time you like reauthorize it. And that just lends itself to long-lived tokens and long-lived grants. So instead, with cross-app access, the tokens that are issued can be very short-lived because there's always an opportunity for the application to get a new token without bothering the user again, right? So like we can, because it's all behind the scenes and we've removed the user interaction, we can do that kind of thing.
There's a few other interesting points to draw out on that one. A bit of callback, Aaron was talking about the OAuth phishing that happens in there. And that's depending on the maturity, again, of like the OAuth ecosystem, you take, Box and Google, they've got quite a few OAuth controls that are put in place and the opportunity for administrators to go in and allow list specific client IDs to be used. But that level of maturity is not consistent throughout the ecosystem. And so this again is like the challenge is either for every ISV to introduce a very mature OAuth policy layer, or just inherit the policy layer that comes from the IDP. So like there's that good thing. The other one that I think goes along with this, reducing the token theft, these post authentication breaches that are going to take place, and that's the direction everybody went. As soon as we started putting in, phishing resistant authenticators and MFA, it was like, well, let's not attack the login process. Let's just go get the resulting tokens that land afterwards. That becomes like there's a secondary control element to that, and again, consequence of like the IDP not being in the flow, you end up with a disparate, following the breadcrumbs of where these tokens have been issued and where they exist is very diffuse when it doesn't go through cross-app access. And so the administrators are, they have to take on more burden to go in and put those secondary compensating controls that are going to be in there. Like this is not a silver bullet, but it is a meaningful step forward that does allow for a lot more consolidated, breadcrumbs to exist, so that as you're looking at the secondary controls that are going to go into place, you can go to the IDP, you can see where the tokens are and follow those breadcrumbs from there versus needing to go out to the mesh that exists and hope that you've got the right logs if they even produce them.
Well, Matt, I think that also doesn't that open up the gateway to other controls? Like I know Aaron's a busy guy. He's got a lot of proposals out there for different extensions. I know he's worked with certain individuals on global token revocation, and like doesn't this give us a great way to establish a cleaner contact to remove access, like the on behalf access for these like adjacent machines? Now that we're in this interconnected like app world that we're in with AI and everything, the user is extended to many different applications and processes that are now operating on its behalf. And that, that lends itself to being able to sever those connections specifically for those. So you're feeling like this is a good way to start bolstering some of those other things like shared signals and even global token revocation.
I think the two go hand in hand usually. I think about what we're doing with cross app access, and it's not branded, way off brand, but I think of it as single sign on steroids. And something that we realized a few years ago as we launched universal logout and the global token revocation spec to go out there and give us a way to close the door, right? Single sign on is great at getting you in the door, but we don't have a really codified way to go close the door. And when we introduce cross app access, you're making more sign-on events. And so, yeah, global token revocation or shared signals framework as a mechanism to give what a continuous channel of communication between these services becomes huge. Today we're using it to just exchange risk signals primarily from security providers, but the opportunity for that to be a more rich, targeted app-to-app back channel communication is pretty rich, or just the explicit global token revocation. Yeah, the two go hand in hand.
Even before an ISV implements global token revocation, if cross-app access is allowing these very short-lived tokens, then you can do some serious damage control simply by not issuing the next token. We get this giant payoff, really, for the kinds of technologies to get those insights into what's going on with a user, such as risk signal sharing. Suddenly there's something we can do with it.
Yeah, it definitely opens the door. I mean, it's within the Okta ecosystem, we can close the Okta session, but yeah, being able to then go in and say, not only are we closing the Okta session in response to some of these things, but maybe we'll rescind access for those cross-app access JAG exchanges to take place. If you can compress the time window of validity of a access token on a downstream app, that means you're going to get more opportunities for the IDP, in that centralized policy and perspective to interdict.
Yeah, of course, it's obviously better to shut that door the moment you realize you need to, but just not leaving it open longer than you have to is still an improvement.
Small steps.
Small steps, and the less new code that we have to ask people to write to get things working, the better. What brings me to a question that I'll bet a lot of listeners are having, which is, how much new implementation are we going to be looking at to add cross-app access to our integrations?
Really good question. Remember that there are 3 parties involved in cross-app access, right? There's the IDP, like Okta, which is the one responsible for, that's where the admin goes to configure the policies of which apps can talk to which. And there's 2 apps. There's the requesting app and the resource app, or the app that's trying to get the data from some other application. There is very different amounts of work on both sides of that equation. So if you are building the application, if you're building the API that is trying to be used by some other application in this, the assumption is that you currently use OAuth for your API, and that you already have a way for third-party developers to register applications and send users through an OAuth flow and all that stuff. And you already issue access tokens, which means that you have a token endpoint somewhere, and that token endpoint supports the authorization code grant type in OAuth, which is the sort of default OAuth flow. The other assumption is that you also already do single sign-on to an enterprise IDP like Okta, probably through OpenID Connect. So with those 2 things in place, the amount of work you have to do to add cross-app access is actually very small. It's essentially add a new grant type to your token endpoint, and you will see a new token come in that's a JSON Web Token with this new grant type, and you need to validate that token and then decide whether to issue an access token and for what user. And all the information about how to validate the token is in the spec, but essentially it'll be signed by Okta, so you'll know which of your customers it is. It'll have a user ID in it that you should already recognize. It'll have the application that would have been your third-party application. And it should actually be a relatively small amount of work to then validate that and then create your own access token like you normally would, whatever format that's in, doesn't matter, and issue that down to the application.
I nearly got that, but we had a lot of you in there. So to make it really concrete, let's say that it's our chat app that is going to be as the requesting party, and then Okta, of course, is going to be our identity provider, and then our calendar app is going to be our resource server, because our chat client wants to show our status of when we're in a meeting on our calendar. The U that needs to have the token endpoint and support SSO, that's going to be both the chat app and the calendar, right?
So I was only talking about the calendar app in that example. So I was talking about if you're building the calendar app that has the data that is trying to be accessed, That's the you in that previous
Then
example.
you've got a token endpoint, you add your grant type, and then
Yeah.
you see these requests for tokens come in.
From the chat app. So the chat app is ultimately making the request for the token still. It's just that instead of doing a regular OAuth redirect blah 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 sequence, it's done something else. We'll get back to that later. It's done some other stuff, and it just shows up at your token endpoint with a JSON Web Token that was signed by Okta.
Oh. So if I'm the calendar, then the chat app just shows up and says, hi, I have a token. Okta signed it. You check the signatures. You go, why, yes, Okta really does want this connection to happen. And bam, you're connected.
Exactly. That basically means on the calendar app, there is one step. Token comes in, you send the token back. You send an access token back. There's no longer redirects or multi-step. It's just one request.
All we've got to do in order to share resources via cross-app access is learn to listen for this new type of request.
Exactly. Yeah.
And now if we want to request resources, how's that going to look?
So that's quite different. So again, we're assuming that in this example, the chat application already does OAuth, a redirect OAuth to the calendar and has an OAuth client registered there. And this chat app also does single sign-on through Okta. The difference is that we take advantage of the fact that the user has already signed in to the chat app through Okta. So as soon as the user signs in, the chat app has an ID token from Okta. And that's, again, baseline today, right? And you use the ID token to figure out who the user is and which user to sign into the application. Now we're saying, take that ID token, go back to Okta and tell Okta, I'm the chat app. I'm trying to get access to this user's calendar, and where this user is represented by the
And
ID
here's
token
whose,
which
here's
sent
the
back.
token.
So here,
Yeah.
exactly. So you go back to Okta and say, hey, I'm trying to get access to this user's calendar. Please let me do that. And then Okta will go and evaluate all the policies, blah, 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 that the admin has configured and decide whether or not to allow this request to happen based on a bunch of, all those factors. And if the request is allowed, Okta will generate this new JSON Web Token, this new JOT, and reply back to that request. That JSON Web Token represents the fact that for this customer, their admin has configured this app to talk to this app for this user, and that's all sort of encapsulated in that JSON Web Token. And then the chat app will take that JSON Web Token over to the calendar saying, hey, I want to access this user's calendar. Okta said it was okay.
And then we'll just repeat that. Hey, Okta, give me the token for the calendar whenever we need to refresh that. So Okta has so much more knowledge about exactly who's been authorized when.
So the difference is basically you replace your redirect-based OAuth flow with this alternative way to make a request for an access token. And the alternative being two post requests. Right? It's a post request to Okta and then a post request over to the calendar.
So I think what's worth calling out there is like in the end user consent flow, what's visible to the IDP is in essence probably two single sign-ons. Like I just know that I've signed into the chat app and the calendar app. That's it.
This is a really, really important thing. And like we actually haven't really described that in this conversation yet.
Without cross-app access.
Yeah.
We want our chat status to show when we're in a meeting on our calendar. We're logged into our chat.
Without cross-app access, the way it works is the user signs into the chat app first. So they will do a single sign-on flow to Okta, and Okta sees some users trying to sign into the chat app, and then decides whether to send an ID token to the chat app, and then they're signed in, right? And the policy enforcement in that flow is this user assigned to the chat app, right? And the answer might be no, in which case the request would fail. So user signs into the chat app. Then the chat app wants access to the calendar. So the chat app does an OAuth flow to the calendar. And that's with the chat app's client ID to the client of the client they've registered at the calendar's OAuth server, which is not Okta, right? So then they start an OAuth flow to the calendar. The calendar says, I don't know who this user is. There's just a user in a browser that shows up. So the calendar app starts a new single sign-on flow to Okta. So the user lands in Okta. Okta sees, oh, some user is trying to sign into the calendar. We'll let them in. And then the calendar says, now I know who the user is. Sure, I'll give an access token to the chat app. So what did Okta see in that example? Okta sees users trying to sign into the calendar. That's it. The Okta does not see that the calendar is then going to share the resources by issuing an access token to some other third-party application. That's the blind spot.
And so now you put that all together. So what Okta sees effectively now is user logged into both apps, but this other added nugget of information that we've made this intent to exchange for that JAG token. And so now that gives us the signal that not only is the user logged into both apps, but there's an intention of these apps communicating the data between the two on behalf of that user.
We talk about the blind spot. That's also a very painful experience and a very different experience depending on the resources. Like the IDP discovery that happens is inconsistent. It's the end user experience for that. We've had some people, in some of the conversations are just like, is there anything you can do in the meantime to just make that process more seamless? And it's something that's really outside of our control. The implementations on the various service providers and how they do IDP routing and that user experience is something that's just way outside of our control, with lots of validation that it is not fun for anybody involved.
In a world where everyone was using this, or even where the consent flow were implemented as a subset of this in hypothetical future implementations, it's so much less code, especially on the resource side. There's just so much less logic you have to worry about.
That was a very intentional design decision of the protocol as well, of leveraging as much of the existing infrastructure that you already have, leveraging as much of the existing specs and things that so that, and making it as easy as possible on the resource side in particular, because there's sort of more value gained on the app that's trying to sign a user in and get access to data because they want the data, so they're going to be more motivated to do work to get the data, versus the company that's on the API side of, like, we have an API, it already supports OAuth. Why do you need to do anything different? So they're less motivated intrinsically to do work to support this new feature. So we made that amount of work they have to do as low as possible.
Matt, you talk to a lot of integrators who are building with this. What typically surprises them the most about cross-app access?
I wouldn't say that we've had any surprises, but there's numerous questions. I mean, client registration, how is Okta dealing with, mapping client IDs for these things? And is there a path to removing some of that burden? Lots of conversations that'll start to trail into like dynamic client registration. On the requesting side, lots of conversations around like, what should we put a consent flow in front of a user and let them know that this is happening or not, and should we do fallbacks? Should we configure policy that doesn't allow for a traditional code flow grant to go through? And so most of it is just like exploratory, like what are the impacts and implications going to be? I wouldn't say that I've heard any like grand surprises.
Being in the conversations with Matt, one thing I'll say about Matt is like he's an engineer at heart, and just hearing all of the gears turning while like with the integrators and with Matt on the call as they're trying to work this all out, like a couple of things like, how am I going to know what apps are going to support this? It's this fearless, I want to get into the wild, but I want to be safe at the same time. I'll echo what he says is like, it's a lot about discovery. It's a lot about what are the graceful fallbacks. Like, realistically, like this is new, very radical, like simplistic in its design and orientation, but very like revolutionary in what the impact is going to be. So that takes time. Again, it's evolutionary. It's on scales of time, right? I love to see the integrators and customers kind of lean in. Like, how do I get started? How do I successfully navigate this without creating too many like really distinct lines and that can end up being counterproductive to the adoption? So yeah, I'll echo that, Matt. It's been a joy like being along the ride to hear like you work through those problems with the integrators live.
You're getting the kinds of questions where the answer is, it depends. So what are we finding that it most frequently depends on for those questions like, should we force the adoption of this for this particular use case? Or how should we fail over if it's not supported by another app? Those kinds of things.
I think a lot of it is ultimately going to come down to what the end customers want, because that's who we're all serving in the end here, right? Is like, there's at the end of this chain of all these different people involved in these flows, there's someone paying for the service to work a certain way, and they probably have requirements or opinions, and ultimately we're going to have to enable some amount of those requirements and opinions that we all agree are an acceptable amount of them. So that's why it depends.
Yeah, I think that's pretty spot on. I was a customer in the past too, and so I'm oftentimes putting myself in that, like, what would I be expecting? It's a little bit, my knowledge is a little bit stale, but there's a lot of, it depends, and some of that opinion, there's going to be opinion. There's also going to be, existing frameworks and tools that people have that are going to kind of, shape and steer what customers are expecting, this outcome to be. Some of this becomes a little bit of like black magic too, and so I think there's going to be a really interesting curve of adoption and understanding, both from an ISV perspective and the customer perspective, as this starts to matriculate through. And so yeah, nuance is everybody's favorite thing when it comes to making some of these things, but we're trying to keep everything on rails, and like, let's, are we going to do down scoping, and the ability to do additional things for a lot of people that are looking forward. They see the opportunity. You can see them really just like open up at the idea of like what's possible when we do this. But we're really just trying to land step number one and get more of that feedback.
One of the reasons why, I know Aaron's had this repo out that we've developed in the open. I've worked on it. My teams have, is again, so we can, get this in the hands. Like I've been a software buyer just like you've, Matt, and like my engineering brain goes to like, well, how would I do this? Like I think I'm a reasonably, competent individual. I might be able to like reason out how I would get there. And so having that like tactile feel about what does the feature look like, what does it actually mean, as a builder, also can articulate the need more clearly. And I think like if you look at some of the other standards that are out there, like IPSI, is like putting an articulation to the enterprise need so that customers can say, yeah, I want that. Like if you're not selling me that, then we don't really have that much to talk about. That's like kind of the simplistic articulation that we need to cultivate. And again, that's also why it's, one, good to go for an open standard, and two, develop that out in the open, so that again, we're doing this all for the customer needs. It's so that they can help us like lead the charge and drive that demand.
As an integrator, depending on whose problems your software solves, you'll probably see a relatively biased set of organizations, especially at first, the people that your integration is like the best fit for. And then when you start looking at branching out, selling to more than just those people who already knew they needed you, then seeing what others' customers have asked for from them can be super helpful to just understand those prospective customers for you. So are we seeing trends yet in those end user customer, those identity admin demands and requests and preferences, or is it kind of still too soon to say?
I think I would lean on that. It's too soon to say, but I'm pretty excited. I think we have some good design partners, in the opportunity to put some templates, to put an opinion out there that people can tear down is kind of what we're expecting to see. But I think we'll put some good examples out and watch it evolve.
So shifting gears a little bit, I know Octane is around the proverbial corner. I wanted to get some ideas from you two. What is getting you excited? I know there's a lot of fanfare about a lot of things happening at Octane, but what particularly is kind of like on your list or has you piqued an interest in what you're most excited about for the event?
Definitely excited about cross-app access. It has been something that I've been working on for a very long time, about a little over 18 months, I think now. So it's very exciting to see this come and become real. We've had a lot of prototypes and sketches and API calls that we've seen for a long time, but seeing it with actual UI and getting it's just very exciting for it to be real.
I like all that. I've been in the backseat of the journey, for those 18 months, thinking and talking about this. I think Aaron and I got pretty excited, as the AI adoption became pretty clear that was going to be the driving force behind this. We'd had cursory calls before that had really taken fire, 12 months ago with customers, and there was interest, but it was small and contained, and it was really difficult to get anybody to prioritize it. And so it was very, very timely that we've seen, the opportunity that AI has created in this for it to be something that's on people's roadmap because they recognize that. So being able to see on the main stage some of those UI mockups to make this real for customers, to make this more real for ISVs, for them to see what those policies are like. I think that's another thing, when you're talking to people, and it's our mock-ups and our wireframes, and you're talking about the protocols and the ins and outs. I think it's not everybody has all of that what is Okta context in there. And so, I think the three of us on those calls, like, we see it really clearly, but the ISVs have an occluded view of what the IDP is capable of doing in there. And so putting that picture out in front of them, it's going to be huge, so that I'm looking forward to our session where we'll have Box and Coda Grammarly there to kind of talk through and share some of their experiences and their opinions on how that's going to land for them. So I'm pretty excited for that one.
So I'm gonna jump in real quick because I love the modesty, but I could tell you I've been locked in rooms with these two guys working and refining on these pitches. What we're going over, I'm proud too. Like we've put a lot of our effort in. Like Aaron leading the charge, like for 18 months working on this. Matt and I coming in, relatively late to put some more structure in. This has been like a lot of our, the adage of blood, sweat, and tears going into this. And yeah, getting this now like central footing across the Octane is definitely like been a labor. A lot of what you guys talked about, we've been through change. Like we lived through the MCP rise, and Aaron's working in that group as well to build the structure around authorization as a whole, including cross app access. But yeah, like it's very exciting, and I'm definitely very honored to work with you two, and like bringing this thing to life. And like there is hopefully like a celebration and rousing acceptance of this, and it is exciting to have committed partners that are like they see the value alongside of us, and want this to be a reality just as much as we do. Yeah, and a quick plug, we'll throw some links in the bottom here. Cross App Access is available in our integrator free org. So if you go to developer.okta.com, sign up, you can turn the self-service EA flag on. We do have example repos. Again, those links will be down below. You can explore this with a common scenario doing leak resolution, or you can go into a more adventurous state and look at agents working with MCP servers. So choice is yours. Choose your own adventure, all of that great stuff. But please, download and get involved and let us know what you think.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the podcast, and I hope that we will see you at Octane. Remember to sign up for Octane Online, link below in the description if you haven't already.